Now for today's program. Dr. Gavriel D. Rosenfeld is president of the Center for Jewish History in New York City and professor of history at Fairfield University. He is the author or editor of 8 books, including most recently, The Fourth Reich, The Specter of Nazism from World War II to the Present, and Fascism in America, Past and Present, which he co-edited with Janet Ward and will be released in August. He is an editor of the Journal of Holocaust Research and edits the blog, The Counterfactual History Review. Amy E. Schwartz is Moment's opinion and book editor, as well as editor of the magazine's popular Ask the Rabbi section. Before coming to Moment, Amy was a longtime editorial writer and op-ed columnist at the Washington Post, covering education, science, and culture, and where she was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize in commentary. Amy is president of the Non-Denominational Jewish Study Center in Washington, D.C., and speaks and runs workshops on topics of Jewish commentary, Psalms, and literature nationwide. Please welcome Dr. Gavriel D. Rosenfeld and Amy E. Schwartz.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out or staying in. I guess I should say Happy Valentine's Day before we get into this not at all celebratory topic. Dr. Rosenfeld, we're so glad to have you here with us, and I want to talk about anti-Semitism sort of in with three questions. First of all, where are we? Secondly, how did we get here? And this is your expertise. And third, is there any way to get back? Looking at the process, how do we reverse this process? So, in terms of where we are, yesterday the American Jewish Committee issued a new report. It's telling us more of what we already know. They're dropping some really sort of alarming numbers. I think it alarmed even them. 19% of American Jews have experienced anti-Semitism personally. 41% say they feel less safe than they were a year ago. 38% have changed their public behavior in some way. And as you wrote in your piece for the Times of Israel recently, what used to be implied through dog whistles is now being shouted through bullhorns. So tell us, how did we get to this point all of a sudden? Is it suddenly everywhere?
These are all very important questions. So, I'm a historian. So one of the topics that I've focused on for much of my career is the history of anti-Semitism in Germany, starting in the late 19th century, going through the Weimar period, up through the Nazi period, and we all, of course, know what happened during the Holocaust. Compared to that, what we're going through now is alarming, but it's a pale shadow of what Jews in the Western world have suffered in the 20th century. So I don't want to say that the sky is falling. Moreover, even in the history of the United States, for any of you that have some spare time and want to go onto Wikipedia and look up the category of attacks against American synagogues, there were already a dozen bombings of synagogues in the late 1950s, early 1960s, mostly in the South. My own synagogue in 1983 in Bloomington, Indiana, of all places, was firebombed and had severe damage, so that our congregation had to worship in a Lutheran church next door for an entire year. And the FBI ended up catching the group, which was sort of a white nationalist, anti-Semitic outfit that was called the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. And we know there are all these kinds of fringe groups, but they've been violent for a long time. We're familiar with the Poway synagogue shooting. We're familiar with Pittsburgh's Tree of Life, but none of this is 100% new. So let me just reassure everyone that we've gone through bad times before. Usually we've been targeted in tandem with other minority groups in the United States, so that all the synagogue bombings in the South in the late 50s and early 60s were because of the perceived and in many respects real alliance between American Jews and African Americans striving for civil rights. And the people responsible for those attacks were KKK members, white nationalists, and so forth. But all that being said, what we do face today that is radically new is the social media universe that all of us are still trying to acclimate to, whether it's how we shop, whether it's how we make our vacation plans. Social media, internet websites, they are transforming everything about modern life. And I think there's no surprise it's going to transform, those things are going to transform hatred as well. So in some of my recent writings, what I've been trying to do is examine what the unintended consequences have been of a wide open social media universe where people can post anything they want online without gatekeepers. They can do it anonymously. They can do it to transcend time and space, so that unlike the white nationalists or neo-Nazis of the 70s and 80s who had to mimeograph, some of you may remember that verb, mimeograph their pamphlets and spread them, covertly like Samizdat literature in the former Soviet Union, that difficulty has long been left by the wayside in our present day world of tweets and posts and God knows the dark web, and people can post anything they want, wherever they want, and then radicalize people in the process. So this is uncharted territory. I don't think by any stretch of the imagination Jews are uniquely experiencing this. It's happening to all groups, but it is something we have to monitor. And like I said, in some of my recent writings, I've been trying to trace a larger arc of what began much more innocuously with regard to Nazi imagery online and how that imagery has increasingly gotten more and more overt, so much so that now when Kanye West can go online and whether on a YouTube video or even on a live interview, say blatantly hateful things that never would have been tolerated in polite society once upon a time, or when Donald Trump can have dinner with Kanye and Nick Fuentes at Mar-a-Lago and somehow thinks people aren't going to pay attention to that, with Fuentes being an avowed neo-Nazi. That's a new situation. So that's what I think is worrisome.
Let me jump in. Let me pick up on your your phrase when you said things that would not have been acceptable in polite society. And the name of this talk and of a lot of what you've been writing lately is about, quote, the normalization of anti-Semitism, which seems, looking around, as if that's the thing that's new, at least for these years. I'm sure, anti-Semitism was quite normal, as you say, in the 50s and before, but it hasn't been normal of late. It's been really kind of off limits, and that seems to have changed. At some point, that obviously changed. Can we zero in on the mechanism a little bit? Who are the influencers? Who makes this? What factors make something seem normal, and who decides?
Right. So at any given point in time in any society, there are all kinds of norms that people subscribe to, whether they're norms about marriage, love, sex, relationships, whether they're norms about drinking behavior, drug use, you name it. And then the question becomes, why at certain points in time do those values and norms change? In fact, if you go back to the actual etymology of the word normal or normality or normalization, it comes from the Latin root norma, which was apparently the word that carpenters used to describe their measurement device that would help them create a baseline standard for any kinds of things they were going to construct made out of wood. So if you think about why things stay normal for a while, and then why the definition of normality changes over time, it's because they're usually people pushing the envelope forward. Now, in a negative sense, when Donald Trump ran for president in 2015, then got elected, you saw the explosion of media reports talking about the shattering of norms in American society. The fact that somebody could get elected who had no prior political experience and was the reality TV show host, and of course had a million scandals associated with him, and none of that was ultimately a liability. That was the kind of thing that for left liberals highlighted the fact that we're in a new phase of normalizing deviance. And so normalization in that respect, it accelerated after 2016. And then after the Charlottesville riots in 2017, President Trump said that there were good people on both sides, the anti-fascists and the fascists. That was letting the sort of cat into the hen house in terms of normalization as well. And I think it was the AP, or maybe it was Merriam-Webster, they actually declared normalization was the word of the year in 2016, because—
And now you're talking specifically about normalization of Nazi.
Right. And so what I think, the normalization of school shootings, the normalization of things like climate change that people never would have been habituated to, but then all of a sudden, the more they're with us, the more people think like, well, I guess this is just the new reality, the new normalcy. And anti-Semitism has very much followed that same pattern. But it's not been organic. It's not been natural. It's not been accidental. There's been a lot of intentionality behind this. And some of the images that you and I were discussing earlier online, I think, can illustrate what I've called the normalization of anti-Semitism in the digital sphere, or what might be described alternatively as the migration from irony to ideology, which I don't know if this is a good time, Amy, to show some of the illustrations that will illustrate this, but
Sure. This is why don't you just take us through your images? They're very interesting.
Sure. So back in 2015, I published a book called Hi Hitler, not Heil Hitler, but Hi Hitler, on the normalization of the Nazi past in contemporary culture. And one of the things that I talk about in the final chapter, which is about the status of Nazism on the internet, is that in the last generation, there's been an enormous phenomenon that I call the law of ironic Hitlerization, which we'll talk about in a second. But it started up in the late 2000s, early 2010s, where for whatever reason, and social scientists and cultural critics had to kind of figure it out initially, there were all kinds of people spontaneously uploading images that pertain to Hitler or the Nazis, and they were trying to elicit chuckles and laughs in the process.
If you can't read if this is too small to read, the headline on the top says, "Cats that look like Hitler."
Right, so Cats That Look Like Hitler is a website that was founded by a Dutch guy, and I think a gentleman from Britain. Went up around 2011, if I'm not mistaken, and was basically just a user-generated website for cats that had mustaches that looked like Hitler's mustache. And before long, you have thousands and thousands of these images uploaded. And if you can turn to the next image, you'll see that it became sort of a fleeting cultural phenomenon, so that on the Colbert Report, on Comedy Central, Stephen Colbert, used it as an opportunity to elicit some laughs because, hey, we're living in a world where people think it's funny to upload images of cats with quote unquote Hitler mustaches. And at this point in time, remember, this is in the early 2010s, before the return of white nationalism, before the backlash against the Obama administration, before some of the horrible racial confrontations we've seen in recent years. I think maybe this was a period where people could believe that the Nazi past was so distantly lying in the past that there wasn't any harm, so to speak, in making fun of these things. If you can show the next image, this Cats That Look Like Hitler phenomenon began to spawn, as is so often the case on the internet, copycat creators who now decided to look for other sites, other images that later became aggregated on sites such as fish that might look like Hitler. If you can turn to the next image. Here's one from a website, believe it or not, it's called thingsthatlooklikeHitler.com, where all of a sudden, even innocuous objects like a J.C. Penney tea kettle was seen to be resembling Hitler, and that caused a big controversy in the media for a while as well. If you can turn to the next image, then what you start to see is that iconic memes that had gained millions and millions of followers and imitators and copycats, such as, and don't ask me to explain the logic of this, the cat on the left with the ungrammatical phrase, Icon has cheeseburger, which were part of the genre known as LOL cats or lol cats, LOL meaning, of course, laugh out loud. And then there was a whole series of memes called advice animals. Here's an example of the first one, known as an advice dog. And you would see people saying, creating funny memes with sayings like go to college, plagiarize everything. And then the key image, of course, is the next one, where you'll see that a lot of people, and this illustrates the phenomenon I diagnosed called the law of ironic Hitlerization, started to take the previous normal memes and Hitlerize them. You can see here, having a cheeseburger is one thing, but having Poland, if you're a Nazi cat, obviously evokes the attack of September 1st, 1939. If you go to the next one, you'll see yet another one. Advice Hitler became a copycat version of Advice Dog. And if you go, for those of you with a lot of spare time, if you go onto the website memegenerator.com, you can literally see thousands upon thousands and upon thousands of these kinds of memes where innocuous animals are being Hitlerized. That's to say they're being turned into something Nazified. And if you look at the next couple images, we'll see how this spawns still further imitators. The otherwise blameless character of Hello Kitty became a Nazi stormtrooper here in this image. Burger King was Hitlerized and became Führer King. And if we can turn to the next image, You even have things like Listerine becoming Hitlerine. Now, you might ask yourself, why is this happening? There is sort of an economics of attention on the internet, which holds that anything that can become clickbait, anything that can become the object of public scandal, public attention, is going to easily become monetized. And if you want to gain notoriety on the internet, and by the way, there have been some social scientists who have said that the average amount of time that an ordinary web browser person would spend on an individual website is 7 seconds before logging off and going to another website. If you can't hold people's attention, you're out of business. So one good way to keep people's attention is to scandalize them and to make use of Nazi imagery to corrupt and defame, and maybe if you think it's funny, ironically poke fun at certain images. And this, according to my analysis, created a climate of normalizing Nazi imagery, so that what was originally seen as a sign of hate, a Hitler mustache, a swastika, you name it, now all of a sudden becomes the object of humor and irony. And most of the people who posted these kinds of memes that you see up here on the screen right now, if they earned public scorn or criticism, they'd say, well, we're just making a joke. What, can't you take a joke? Can't you see that we're being ironic and that we have plausible deniability? And if maybe even anything, we're mocking the Nazis, we're mocking Hitler, we're taking them down a notch. Well, that's all well and good until you get to the next image. When you start seeing crudeness and crassness beginning to appear in a lot of images, where you'll see here another example of meme generator creating an iconic meme known as Disco Hitler. And if you take the next image, you'll see how it got turned into a GIF and actually got animated. And on the one hand, sure, you could say you're mocking Hitler by turning him into a John Travolta, Saturday Night Fever kind of figure. But at the same time, what I argue is that Hitler is being de-demonized in the process. He's being turned into a warm, cuddly, funny guy who you can kind of hang out with and linger with. And what people are, of course, not doing when they see these images and when they traffic in them is they're not thinking about the crimes committed by the Nazis against the Jews and countless millions of others. And so this is a kind of banalization of Hitler, a trivialization of Hitler that now paves the way to the next part of the slippery slope, where you see actually right-wing neo-Nazi types taking the joke beyond the point where it could have been remotely funny and all of a sudden turning it into something directly hateful. So in the image on the left, which you see is another example of an advice Hitler meme that has the fairly tasteless comment that evokes the pun. These memes are, of course, always based on puns more than anything else. And then you see how the one on the right, mocking Kentucky Fried Chicken, but obviously taking it way beyond the point of plausible deniability. This is getting into things that would only make far right-wing racists and Nazis laugh. And if you can turn to the next image, you'll see how before long these kinds of ostensibly ironic memes became very common on far right-wing neo-Nazi websites, most notoriously the Daily Stormer. Now, I was telling Amy earlier, a couple minutes ago, that I tried to go on the Daily Stormer website, which today is hosted by a server in India, and it seems to be disabled because this website has become the object, justifiably, of a lot of anti-fascist hackers who don't want it to spread its hatred. But I want to direct your attention to the image that's at the lower right-hand part of this screen, which is the iconic and very controversial figure who you may have heard of or maybe not. He's known as Pepe the Frog. So if you can go to the next image, you'll see why this is such an ominous figure. In 2005, the American artist Matt Fury created what at the time was a very benign figure, kind of a lovable slacker named Pepe the Frog, who just kind of hung around, smoked marijuana, drank booze, and felt good for the most part. But starting in the early 2000 teens into the early years of the Trump candidacy and administration, if you turn to the next image, you'll see that he became a symbol, a galvanizing, rallying symbol for people who belong to what's now called the alt-right. So the Oath Keepers, the Proud Boys, the Three Percenters, the Patriot Front, a lot of people that ended up storming the US Capitol on January 6th already in the early 2000 teens were starting to congregate with one another under the banner of Pepe. It's not a swastika. It's not the fascio of Benito Mussolini. It's sort of a jokey figure that they thought would be something that would give them the deniability about being a hate movement. If you turn to the next image, you'll see how before long, the Donald Trump candidacy and later the Donald Trump administration tried to play footsie with the alt-right and later became very much allied with the alt-right as part of the base of the MAGA wing of the Republican Party. And you see that the amalgamation here of Pepe as a character and Donald Trump's own face was something that became a successful, in fact, viral web image. If you can turn to the next image, you'll see that Trump himself began tweeting out on Twitter before he was banned from Twitter, images of himself posing as Pepe, which allowed him to sidle up to the alt-right. If you can turn to the next image, you'll see that when Hillary Clinton called Trump and his far-right wing supporters the deplorables, they embraced this and included Pepe among the ranks of people like Alex Jones, who you see second from the right, who was, as you know, recently successfully sued for close to $1 billion, if I'm not mistaken. You see Roger Stone at the left, Milo Yiannopoulos on the far right. These are people who are obviously appropriating this right-wing image. Keep going, if you don't mind, to the next one. And then even at the storming of the Capitol on January 6th, there are some people who, while trying to quote unquote stop the steal, are identifying with Pepe the Frog. I'll spare you all the, in fact, actually, if you could show the next image, I'll just want to see what, yes. So maybe we'll conclude as follows. So Andrew Anglin, who is the man currently on the lam from the law, he's been successfully sued by many journalists in the United States for libel, for having doxed them and exposed their home addresses and so forth. He's somebody who basically founded the Daily Stormer website, but he explained in a far right-wing extremist pamphlet called A Normie's Guide to the Alt-Right why Pepe the Frog, and in this image you can see he's becoming more blatantly Nazified, but originally he said that Pepe became the alt-right's mascot because he embodies what? The goal of couching idealism, by which we here understand idealism to be right-wing anti-Semitism, within irony. A neo-Nazi movement, he went on to add, using a cartoon frog to represent itself, takes on a subversive power to bypass historical stereotypes of such right-wing movements and thus presents their ideas in a fun way without the baggage of Schindler's List. Or to translate it into English, we, the alt-right, we can't show up in public wearing swastikas because that will immediately stigmatize us and discredit us. We can, however, march under the banner of Pepe and then be warm and cuddly, and by the way, also attract 15-year-old boys who are online during COVID, trying to build community, and maybe we can radicalize them in the process.
That's just a remarkable quote about Schindler's List, by the way.
Yeah, it's very self-conscious, self-aware. This is part of a conscious effort to galvanize a movement of people, mostly young men, tragically, although not only. There have been some notorious women like Riley Williams, who was the one who stormed the Capitol and stole Nancy Pelosi's laptop, who was later exposed as having taken photographs of herself with SS runes, part of the Black Sun. And she also claimed that she was just doing it for jokes and was being ironic. So, you know, unless you're out with a swastika, I suppose you could claim that anything you're doing is ironic and you shouldn't take it seriously. But I think when we come to Kanye West, that's where, and maybe we should go away from the images for a second. We could maybe go back later to some of the merchandise that has been promoted in his name. But when you go to Kanye West, you're seeing that much of this stuff is now just straight up in the open. But what I'd like to at least sum up with respect to the images we just looked at is that this law of ironic Hitlerization, this original ironic approach to Nazi insignia and symbols, that was years in the making. And what it essentially did was prepare the ground for a return of the actual images themselves from the 1930s. So that I don't have an image with me, but if you look at the Patriot Front, which is one of these many alt-right groups, they have as their symbol the fascio, the fasces, the axe and the bundle of wooden rods that has long been the symbol of the fascist movement, and they're just straight up in the open right now.
Huh. So wow, well that series of images really, as they say, is more than 1,000 words. Your mention of Kanye West is a good opportunity to sort of broaden this and go from online to out here in the real world, where normalization, I think, takes a different, but in some ways parallel pattern. Here in the Washington area, we've seen a lot of swastika graffiti in schools, along jogging trails, places where you would really not have seen it before. And I want to I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how that process either has echoed what's going on online or is somehow independent of it.
No, it's a parallel phenomenon whereby the images that I've just shown have mostly been posted anonymously. Apart from avowed neo-Nazis like Andrew Anglin, most of the people have done this as part of an effort just to get attention for themselves and their own web identities and so forth, but they're usually under pseudonyms. What makes the Kanye episode so disturbing is that this represents what we might call the celebrification of anti-Semitism, whereby a celebrity who's used to endorsing products to make money, whether it's Coca-Cola or Toyota Camrys, now they're endorsing anti-Semitism, and they're not doing it anonymously. They're doing it in full public awareness that their brand, their personal brand, is going to lend prestige to the ideas they're now promoting. And then, of course, will then spread the appeal of those ideas, because anyone who identifies with Kanye, regardless of whether they're a teenager or someone in their 60s, all of a sudden he's made it socially acceptable to make claims about Jews controlling the music industry, or Jews doing negative things to the Black community for generations. So I think he is the first person who hasn't been ashamed about being linked to anti-Semitism in the same celebrity way that he has. Trump, obviously, by dining with Nick Fuentes, wasn't shy about that either, although he would always kind of hedge and claim that some of the things that he was doing was in the spirit of balance or not meant to do anything overtly anti-Semitic. And besides, he's a supporter of Israel, so how can he be anti-Semitic? The Kanye episode, though, was sort of a quantum leap in the sense that it was going to give clearance to people who otherwise would have been ashamed about associating with things that were just done from the dusty corners of the internet. Now they can do it in full view. And I think this morning in Tablet, the online magazine, reported that up to 30 copycat incidents have taken place in the U.S. since the late October, early November scandal involving Kanye.
Incidents in what sense? Like incidents
of people either like on the Los Angeles 405 freeway draping banners saying Kanye was right about the Jews. That was the Goyim Liberation Front. And in Jacksonville, Florida, there have been several incidents during football games of the Jacksonville Jaguars where unknown people shown or screened anti-Semitic video on high-rise buildings saying Kanye was right. And if that's a slogan that the far right increasingly embraces because he made it okay, even if it's only a small percentage of people who think it's okay, that's still a larger percentage than was the case before. And what you don't want to see is the slow, steady drip, drip, drip of one celebrity saying it's okay, and then the next week 3 celebrities saying it's okay. And we know that there are certain representatives in Congress, like Paul Gosar and Marjorie Taylor Greene, who have started to say things that are pretty openly anti-Semitic, not to mention the converse, which is the claims of some of these MAGA Republicans who, when called out about their own anti-Semitism, say that, in fact, the real Nazi is Joe Biden, because he made people get coronavirus vaccines when, free American constitutional life means the government doesn't get in your business.
So that's another version of going somewhere which wouldn't ordinarily have been normal, right? In the United States, we don't typically call our political opponents Nazis.
Yeah, I mean, it's been called Holocaust Inversion, where the very people who are promoting anti-Semitism claim that they're the victims of Nazis, that they are the new Jews, which is why, by the way, you've probably many of your audience members have seen in Germany and in the United States, people who are anti-vaxxers marching in public with yellow stars of David with COVID-19 written on them because they want to claim the same mandate of, being a Holocaust or a Jewish victim of tyranny.
Right. Well, let me broaden the context a little more on that. We're talking about two different sort of roads to desensitization. Right. On the one hand, these ironic memesters who are using it to sort of slide in on to make it almost a positive thing, and then on the other side, these groups using it as a sort of just another negative, just another thing to say, well, you're a Nazi. And, there's been a wider discussion about when you can call someone a Nazi and, how easy it is for something to devolve to people calling each other Nazis. But, I'm curious, I mean, when that thing happened with Kanye, I'm going to sort of give you a counter, kind of push back a little bit as a hypothetical exercise. When the thing with Kanye happened, there was a tremendous uproar. There was pushback, I think, not just from Jews, but from the whole society. There were generally the mainstream was outraged. Within 3 days, he was no longer a billionaire. So the question is, on the one hand, and when people put swastikas up or do make anti-Semitic attacks in the real world, typically law enforcement gets involved. So that seems like a pretty powerful pushback against the idea that there's anything normal about this. It's not only not normal, it's not even legal. Does this help, or the other argument, or is that just another way of desensitizing people and making it worse? Does the uproar against Kanye just continue, just spread it more widely, or is it actually helpful?
Sure. Well, I mean, one argument, of course, was that the pushback against Kanye only shows how powerful Jews really are, because when he was saying things, when he was wearing, for example, a Confederate flag on one of his jean jackets a couple of years earlier, if I'm not mistaken, there was some criticism from the Black community, but people outside the Black community weren't criticizing him as much as they were after the things he said about Jews. And of course, keep in mind, I mean, he's also not only reproducing classic anti-Semitic stereotypes about Jews, but he's also posting imagery of the Star of David on the flag of Israel intertwined with a swastika. So it's pretty out there. It's not subtle whatsoever. It is a bullhorn. It's not a dog whistle.
And Twitter even the new Twitter actually banned that. So you get a sense of somebody thinks it's out of bounds. So
I totally agree that the mainstream establishment response was exactly what one would want to see. I think the problem is that flying below the radar are millions and millions of teenagers who are being exposed to these kinds of ideas. And even if only 5 or 10% of them become radicalized as a result, that's a huge problem. And, we've seen that hate in general, whether it's people who got drafted into ISIS or Al-Qaeda, were radicalized by online sources, whether it's the whole incel phenomenon of misogyny that young American men have been exposed to. That's been an online phenomenon. So, the problem is that there's a whole generation being exposed to an information, a world of information outside of parental control, outside of teacher control. And so what I guess it creates is this potential for what's called stochastic terror, where people self-radicalize. And despite the fact that nobody's saying, hey, take a gun to a school or a synagogue and shoot people who you've been taught to hate online, there is a self-radicalization dynamic that we've been seeing, not always in a political context. We've seen it in all too many shootings of American institutions. But for those who happen to be gravitating to anti-Semitic hatreds, unfortunately, that's the kind of thing. I mean, Robert Bowers, when he shot up the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh and killed, 11 people, he had self-radicalized online and had been trading a lot of these memes and conspiracy theories like the Great Replacement theory, that the white race is being threatened by genocide at the hands of immigrants brought into the country by Jews. I agree that the response has been good. Law enforcement will always do what it can. But if you can't control the way that these hatreds manifest themselves in self-mobilizing actions by the quote unquote lone wolves, then we're in a heap of trouble.
Right, right. And I mean, I'm remembering the way you described the teens, I'm thinking about in the 90s when young people would sometimes take on sort of the neo-Nazi persona because it made people angry, because it was forbidden, and so in some ways the pushback is part of the process. So we have just about enough time before we take questions. I'm going to ask you to solve the problem.
Oh, good. Well, I mean, the encouraging thing, of course, is that the same technology that is being used against, in our conversation today, Jews, although not obviously only Jews, it can also be turned in sort of a, Asian martial arts metaphor against the person using it in the first place. So, in in my Times of Israel piece, I pointed out that after Kanye was using social media to promote hate, many web users decided to crash his Reddit page by bombarding him with counter Kanye, pro-Jewish, anti-fascist imagery, so that the website was disabled. There are lots of other instances where Jews and the allies of Jews have broadcast their pride in being Jewish, so that some of you on Twitter have perhaps heard of how a lot of anti-Semites were, a couple of years ago, exposing, quote unquote, the Jewish identity of certain people online, say like Chuck Todd from MSNBC, who's Jewish but doesn't have a recognizably Jewish name. They would surround Chuck Todd, the name, with 3 sets of parentheses, which are known as echoes, as a way to sort of expose the Jewishness and the ubiquity of Jews in the media. Well, a lot of Christian journalists decided to start putting those very same parentheses around their own names. So if your name was McGillicuddy and you have 3 parentheses around your name, you're showing that either you are Jewish and people just don't know, or maybe you're just showing solidarity with Jews. And these are the kinds of things, as they become mass cultural phenomena, they do represent a pushback. I mean, obviously, you can always send donations to the ADL and the Southern Poverty Law Center, and you can sick your sort of technologically adept nieces and nephews or grandkids against some of these people and immobilize their technological ability to spread hate. But depending on your generation, there's definitely things that all of us can do. But the first and foremost thing is I think we do need to rethink the regulation of technology in our present day world. We're still living in the Wild West of the information revolution. And what I imagine people will say about us 30 years from now is that how on earth could we live in this unregulated world, sort of like in the late 1800s when, the government hadn't yet allowed unionization in the steel or coal industry, and the railroads were allowed to be used by the robber barons for, whatever they wanted, or, the fact that there wasn't an EPA or an FDA. We're living in a still a very unregulated phase of this social media world we live in and the internet world more broadly. I don't doubt that years from now, we'll be grateful that in 1 or 3 or 5 years, there'll be some timely legislation passed to sort of bring under control much of what we're commenting on today.
So you don't think that suppressing this kind of thing on social media will just drive it underground?
Well, I do think, just to give you one concrete example, if you think about how some mainstream news organizations like Fox News have been mainstreaming and normalizing the Great Replacement theory, which once upon a time was a totally discredited far right-wing fringe theory, but now it's in the mainstream because it's being given airplay. There was a thing called
maybe remind the viewers in a sentence.
The Great Replacement theory. It's Renaud Camus, who was a famous French theorist in the 70s, who argued in the European context that non-European, non-Christian, mostly Muslim immigrants were flocking to Europe, and before long, the white race was going to die out or become dominated by non-white people. That spread, of course, to the United States among white nationalist groups who are, trying to figure out, as America becomes, before long, a majority non-white society, how they're going to cope with that reality. And Fox News has used it to great effect. But there used to be something until the Reagan administration called the Fairness Doctrine that forced all media outlets to allow the competing, opposing opinion to be aired, so that one side of a political debate couldn't create an information bubble and sort of indoctrinate their listeners without them being exposed to the other side. Turns out it was under the FDR administration that the fairness doctrine got pioneered. Why? Because people like Father Coughlin, who was spewing his anti-Semitic invective on the radio airwaves up until the early 1940s, was allowed to do so until the Roosevelt administration stepped in and said, you know what, we're going to respond to popular outrage about this hate speech by clamping down on it, by saying you actually have to have two sides of the argument. There have been countless journalists who have said, let's bring back the fairness doctrine, but that would require a sort of sea change in American culture that would, become more comfortable with government regulation, which I need not tell anyone has never been that popular among a certain segment of the electorate.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, let's step back one more. Let's take a step away from the practical and looking at. I mean, you've talked about this idea of normalization. Do you see this process as a thing that can be reversed? I mean, in general, how do you go about, is it possible to take things that, I mean, it's easy to see how things that were taboo, that sort of erodes, but what does the reverse process look like?
Well, I think what's interesting is that normalization has become such an important word in American society in recent years, but not only among liberals afraid of, let's say, the normalization of deviant behavior in the political sphere. It's also been used by conservatives to sort of bemoan what they see is the destruction of a traditional society. Just take the questions of same-sex marriage or anything pertaining to LGBTQ issues, or for that matter, how patriotic history is taught or not taught in our schools. From their perspective, the normalization of anti-Americanism, the normalization of anti-Christian viewpoints, the normalization of, from their perspective, anti-biblical, immoral behaviors, that's something that they would like to resist, just like left and liberal people would like to resist what they view as the normalization of hatreds of all kinds. So just to be clear,
one person's normalization is just the other person's free speech, in other words.
Exactly. So normalization is always going to be wielded as a concept that is meant to galvanize one camp to pursue that which they deem to be normal. I mean, if you believe that homosexuality is a deviant choice that people are making because liberal activists are indoctrinating our kids, that's not the same thing as believing that homosexuality is something that has existed in human society for millennia and it's perfectly natural and therefore it's normal. So there's a campaign to define what's normal and what's abnormal raging in our society far beyond merely the question of anti-Semitism. But ultimately, I think what is deemed to be normal and what's deemed to be abnormal is a question ultimately of politics. So, if there's a critical mass of people who are willing to accept gay marriage as normal, as we've seen in the last 10, 15 years, I mean, keep in mind that both President Clinton and President Obama didn't want to go there in terms of making it permissible. But, what someone like Rush Limbaugh would have said as well, as long as you have enough shows like Will and Grace on mainstream network TV, showing that gay people are just like anybody else, then you're going to lead to a sea change. So the only way to resist normalization is to re-stigmatize something.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And so I think the resistance against anti-Semitism becoming normalized is to make it something worthy of shame again. And I think that's why public pushback against Kanye was so important, because if you lose your record deals or your sneaker deals, it's going to cost you. It's the same, by the way, with the Dominion voting system lawsuit against Fox News, where, if you just spread lies in the media about, your voting machines being rigged by, potentates in Venezuela, and you can get away with it, you're just going to open the door for more lies. But if you have to pay $1 billion fine, then that kind of devil-may-care being liberal with the truth will become re-stigmatized. So you need to have penalties for things that are abnormal that people want to keep abnormal. But unfortunately, a lot of people want to push the envelope in very, very radical directions. And so this is ultimately going to be played out in the political arena, I think, between those people who want to promote a certain vision of what America should be versus others who are probably going to push back and try and preserve an older, antiquated version of what America used to be. And that, I think that was the 2016 election in a nutshell between Hillary and Trump. It was the 2020 election. And whatever issue one looks at, you definitely have people competing for the terrain of being able to determine what will be normal in America going forward.
Right, right. Well, that's all. That's a lot to think about. Suzanne, do you want to take over? Are there some questions from the audience? Thank you so much for
Thank you, Amy.
all those insights and all that background, and for the parallels to other issues too, which I think are very helpful in combating this feeling of helplessness that I think a lot of people feel.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to combine a few questions so we can get to more of them. The first one, do you think when you were showing some of the memes, some of those images, especially for younger people, I would say, are they ignorant and naive and not necessarily really knowing that they are rooted in anti-Semitism? And also there was a question about Soros, and while not being, this person's not a critic of Soros, should we be taking every attack as a code for anti-Semitism when it comes to George Soros?
Right. So I mean, that's why I think Kanye was pretty novel, because there are people who will say things that could be construed as anti-Semitic, but will immediately deny that what they're saying is anti-Semitic, because that's the example of the dog whistle. So if you are, inveighing against globalism or against, New York elites, I mean, those are all code words for Jews. And sometimes people might sort of mimic those things innocently and not know what they're meant to signify. But in the case of Kanye, I think it was pretty straight up. He said the Jews. So that's where at least we have the simplicity of transparency. But with regard to the other ones, I think the people, look, if you're a 12-year-old or 14-year-old boy and you're adding a Hitler mustache to the Teletubbies, which is one of the, common memes that have circulated in recent years, you may not know, and you probably don't know, the intricate history of Nazi Germany and how Hitler rose to power and what he did to the Jews during the Holocaust. But you know that the swastika and the Hitler mustache is somehow transgressive. You know that it's somehow taboo. You know it's somehow going to get you in trouble, because you know full well that everybody who's been doing similar kind of stuff has been earning a lot of notoriety. And one of the things that's sort of a law of the internet is that every new sensation is going to spawn 1,001 imitators. And so if the first person who gets attention for putting a Hitler mustache on a cartoon character like Mickey Mouse gets notoriety, before long you get 500 other cartoon characters being Hitlerized, because all of a sudden you're going to be in the discussion, you're going to be in the conversation, and that's the chief bill of exchange on the internet is notoriety. You got to get it somehow, and there's nothing that causes more notoriety than the Nazis and the swastika. That's why it's always been a go-to symbol.
Mm-hmm. Jon Stewart and others responded to Dave Chappelle's Saturday Night Live monologue, saying it was good to force a conversation about anti-Semitism, though I know some criticized Jon Stewart for what he said. And then somebody else mentioned how Whoopi Goldberg made comments that were seen as anti-Semitic, but people worked through it and she did not lose her show. How do you balance between someone like Whoopi Goldberg and someone like Kanye West, who obviously was blatant about it? Where's that line? And is Jon Stewart right about forcing conversation?
Well, to start, first of all, I'm always happy to have conversation. I think we're in a world these days where all too often people end up silencing other people based on who they are and what credentials or qualifications they bring to the discussion, or even just what their identity is. And as a college professor, someone who's always in a position of having to talk with students about very difficult things, the last thing I want to see is automatic silencing being foisted upon people because they somehow don't have the qualifications to say something intelligent. So Jon Stewart obviously is Jewish. He is qualified based on that metric to say anything he wants about anti-Semitism as he perceives it. But I think one should never shy away from pushback if the substance of his arguments don't really measure up to somebody else's experience. I think it's perfectly legitimate to push back and to criticize him for his argument where it has weaknesses. Just because one's Jewish doesn't give you authority or credibility. There have been plenty of Holocaust survivors who have attacked the Israeli government for their actions in the Arab-Israeli conflict and invoked their credibility as Holocaust survivors to claim 100% truth. And then there are Holocaust survivors who take the exact opposite argument and they would say the exact same thing. So, I would be careful about citing one's credentials before making an argument irrespective of substance. However, with regard to Whoopi Goldberg, it was very different from Kanye insofar as she said something based in certainly misinformation and a misunderstanding of the origins of Nazi anti-Semitism, which very much were focused on the Jews as a race, not a race identifiable by skin color, but certainly a race identifiable by other physical characteristics. I need not mention them. And she did lose her hosting position on The View for at least 2 or 3 weeks, if I'm not mistaken. So it's not like she walked away without anything more than a slap on the wrist. And whether or not that was the right approach or not, we can haggle over that in a different context. But Kanye was certainly exponentially more aggressive and hateful in saying what he was saying, spreading disinformation, not sort of suffering from misinformation in the case of Whoopi.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if you want to clarify. Someone said, so making a meme about Hitler can be considered illegal nowadays. I don't know if you want to clarify what you were saying. And also somebody asked about the reverse, about all the memes that have been made about Donald Trump as Hitler. And how do you feel about those political posts? Yeah, no, I mean, these are very thorny questions. I'm pretty close. Well, am I a free speech absolutist? No, there definitely are things you can't say in public view. Obviously, there's a difference between government sanctioned speech and what you can say or not say in a public school versus what you can say on your own website. In Germany, however, and I've spent many years living there and studying the place, anti-hate speech laws have been in existence since the founding of the Federal Republic in 1949 for obvious reasons, given the fact that the Nazis used hatred to genocidal effect. And so to this day, you can't publish a book with a swastika on it like you can in the United States. You can't deny the Holocaust in the way that you might be able to in the United States, where free speech protects people from, being held accountable for things that might not be popular, but we're always in the sort of John Stuart Mill mode of saying the free marketplace of ideas has to be protected, because otherwise, once you give the government the ability to stifle speech from one group, you're opening up the floodgates for all groups to potentially be suppressed. So I'm certainly conscious of that concept. What I would say is that, and I didn't want to be misunderstood as to say that memes today of Hitler could be banned, but I wouldn't be surprised if in the future the incitement to do violence and the incitement to hate, which you can very quickly go and see on Reddit or 4chan or 8chan or wherever, if the violence gets too out of control with regard to whatever group gets targeted because they were incited by people online, I wouldn't be surprised if either there's tremendous pressure on social media providers to self-censor, like when Twitter kicked Trump off the platform because he was spreading COVID disinformation and also spreading election denial misinformation. Elon Musk has obviously made his pact with the far right. And so he's letting a lot of those people back on, but Twitter has become a cesspool of hatred as a result. And at a certain point, either the electorate in the United States, voters will say enough is enough and force legislators to pass legislation, or there'll be fines or there'll be other boycotts against some of these platforms so that they'll have to do what the government won't step in and do, because we're still, like I said, in the Wild West phase of this whole phenomenon. Mm-hmm. How do your college students react to this talk? And I would add both Jewish and non-Jewish, and is there a difference? And somebody else asked, is part of the problem that kids, even before college, are not educated about the Nazis and the Holocaust the way that Jews are?
I mean, I think the problem is that if you go back to the producers, Mel Brooks's movie from 1968, a lot of people said, too soon. We're all familiar with the fact, I think it's tragedy plus time equals comedy. And anything that's too soon, too close to the occurrence of the tragedy, whether it's 9/11 or whether it's, the recent earthquake in Turkey, I mean, it would be in bad taste to make jokes about things that bring, suffering and pain to our fellow human beings. But it's human nature eventually to start cracking jokes about it. And who are the gatekeepers who determine what is acceptable and what is no longer acceptable? There was a controversy a couple of years ago when HBO wanted to do an alternate history show about the South winning the Civil War. And there have been countless novels and films made about this topic, but if you're going to be proposing that kind of a show in the wake of the Charlottesville riots or in the wake of George Floyd being murdered by police in Minneapolis, people are going to say, this is not the right or proper moment to be making light of certain scenarios. I think it's the same thing with the Holocaust. It's the same thing with Nazi Germany. There's always a temptation to be transgressive and to make fun of things that are stigmatized, because that's what humor is. It's pushing the boundary. It's talking about, sexual positions in a comedy show. It's about talking about things that would never be accepted in polite society. And that's why a lot of people think it's funny. And when I teach my students about this stuff and I show them the Hitler memes, they always laugh initially because they're not thinking about the negative consequences of doing that kind of a thing. And when I show them the Kentucky Fried Jews meme, after showing them the cats that look like Hitler, they start to see that they're on a slippery slope towards becoming radicalized to a certain extent, to accept that something that isn't funny actually is funny. And that's been a recruiting tool, I have to say. It's been a recruiting tool for the far right, getting young, impressionable teenagers into that movement, by first introducing them to the entryway drugs, if you will. And then after you think, cats that look like Hitler are funny. And then after a while, the humor wears off and you're looking for a harder substance. You're looking for a more extreme high. Before long, you're going to go from Diet Coke to Coke, or really Coke. That's when you've been trapped by the far right that's been trying to lure you all along.
Mm-hmm. And so should schools be doing more? And in the wake of all of these states banning teaching about African-American studies, the controversy with the AP exam, are we looking at people wanting to deny having education in schools about the Holocaust?
Well, there have been, so we're all familiar with, I think it was first in the state of Texas, and then other American states started to decree that any historical content that would make students feel uncomfortable or make them feel guilty because of their heritage could not be taught. And there were instances of teachers in the Texas school system saying, we can't teach about the Holocaust because if you're a white Christian and you mention the fact that maybe Christianity sowed the seeds for some of what the Nazis did, then all of a sudden you're going to be made uncomfortable. And as a teacher, you don't want to get fired. So there's a lot of self-censorship that goes on, even on behalf of topics that you would think would be uncontroversial. So I would love to get the government out of the public school system entirely, certainly with respect to how history is taught. And that's one of my own, areas of primary research for that matter is, how history becomes memory and how societies end up learning certain lessons from historical experiences and how they don't learn other lessons. But the worst thing of all is to create a state-supported single narrative about history, because then all you're going to do is, bore students to tears, lead them to assume that you're giving them sort of the party line, and all they're going to do is look for the other side anyway. So you may as well teach history as a nonstop dialogue of competing narratives. And, there is no objective, of one fact after another that contains its own inherent interpretation. Interpretations are always changing given new circumstances in the present day world. And so, we need to know our names and dates and places, but we also need to know how historical narratives have evolved over time. And I certainly wouldn't want censorship to get involved in all that. So I don't call for banning memes. I don't call for limiting free speech at this point. But I do think that consciousness and awareness of how the internet is changing what people are exposed to in terms of our information stream, that's very important.
Thank you. And as we wrap up, I know you talked about this a little bit, but maybe you could expand more. Someone wants to know, as a Jew, what can I do as an individual? And somebody else had written in saying that they are the chair of their Equity and Justice Committee at their church. And what can they, as another faith-based organization, how can they step up and help with this? Well,
so number one, I would say that for American Jews, who are around 2% of the population, we as a collective, we need to understand that American Jews have always been successful in this country by not being just unto ourselves and cloistering ourselves in our own community and not building bridges with other groups, whether it's interfaith Jewish Christian groups, whether it's relations between the Jewish community and the African American community, the LGBTQ community, Latino community. It's really important because we're all in the same boat, so to speak, being minorities, however different our skin colors and religions and ethnicities and races might be, we're all in the same boat because we're not part of the white Christian majority. And so in that circumstance, knowing the history of the United States over several centuries now, I think it's important for us to be there with other groups when they are suffering periods of persecution or discrimination, because then we can, just for reasons of self-interest, have them be there for us when we're in the same situation. So I think that's just good coalition politics. And if you and your synagogue have opportunities to show up like I have had for many years in mine, with the neighboring Episcopalian church or the Lutheran church next door down the street, and if there are moments where you can share a meal or have a joint talk and get to know people from other communities, that's the best way to acquaint yourself with their predicaments and their own situations and anxieties. And I think one of the things that's so often true in American history is that any positive social change only happens through alliance building and coalitions. The most obvious example, of course, being the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, but there have been countless others, whether it's gay liberation, whether it's the green movement. For people who want change, you can't do it by yourself. And the nature of our country requires that we don't look only to our own communities to bring about that change.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Rosenfeld. Thank you, Amy, for bringing this conversation to us. I will be sending out a link to the recording later this week, along with, I'll send a link to Dr. Rosenfeld's website, and you can see the articles that he has written. I want to encourage everybody, this Thursday, we have a brand new Zoominar that was just scheduled with comedian Judy Gold, and she'll be talking about cancel culture and censorship and what it means for comedians and how it spills over to the larger community. Again, thank you, everybody. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. We will see everybody next time. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.